Hello, my name is Helga. I want to tell you about my journey and how I learned to boost my communication skills with these 5 tips. When I look back at the early stages of my journey, I realized that listening was the skill I needed the most. For a long time, I believed communication was all about speaking, how smart you sounded, how many big words you knew, and how quickly you could respond. But the truth hit me hard when I started noticing that people didn't always feel connected to me. I'd talk a lot, share my thoughts, sometimes even interrupt, but later I realized people weren't always hearing me because I wasn't truly hearing them. I remember one specific moment that opened my eyes. I was at a coffee shop near my college in Boston. It was one of those chilly fall mornings where everyone came in with scarves and warm coats, and the smell of pumpkin spice lattes filled the air. My friend Emma was sitting across from me, telling me about a tough situation with her roommate. But instead of really listening, I kept thinking about what advice I should give her and what story of mine I could share next. I even cut her off at one point to say, "Oh, I know exactly what you mean," one time, and then launched into my own story. When I finally stopped talking, I noticed the look on Emma's face. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes looked tired, and she seemed smaller somehow, like she had shrunk back into herself. That's when I realized she didn't need my story, she needed my ears. She needed me to just be there for her, to understand what she was going through. And I had failed her in that moment because I was too busy focusing on my own voice. That day stayed with me. I went back to my dorm, sat on my bed, and thought about how often I had done the same thing, cut people off, rushed to respond, or drifted into my own thoughts while someone else was talking. I thought about how many times I left conversations not really knowing what the other person had said because I was so focused on myself. That realization stung, but it also woke me up. From then on, I made a conscious decision. I was going to become a better listener. At first, it was harder than I thought. Listening sounds simple, but it's not. It requires patience, self-control, and real focus. The next week, when I hung out with Emma again, I tried something different. Instead of planning what I was going to say, I leaned in, looked her in the eye, and just let her talk. I nodded, I asked her follow-up questions, and I let her finish her sentences without interrupting. To my surprise, she opened up even more. She shared details she hadn't told me before, and when she finally stopped talking, she smiled and said, "Thanks for listening. I feel so much better now." That one sentence, "Thanks for listening," was like a gift. It made me realize that people don't always want solutions, they want connection. And connection begins with listening. After that, I started practicing listening everywhere I went. In class, instead of zoning out while my professor spoke, I took real notes and tried to understand his perspective, not just memorize the material. When I called my parents back home, I let them tell me about their day without rushing to talk about mine. Even in casual conversations with strangers at the grocery store or while waiting in line at the campus library, I practiced being fully present. And you know what happened? People started to notice. My friends told me I seemed more thoughtful. Professors appreciated my questions because they were based on what they had just said. Even strangers seemed to warm up to me faster because I wasn't just waiting for my turn to speak, I was truly paying attention. One night, something remarkable happened. I was at a small get-together with friends in our dorm lounge. We were sitting around eating pizza, laughing and sharing stories. Normally, I would have tried to be the center of attention, telling jokes and talking a lot. But that night, I decided to sit back and listen. I asked questions like, "How did you feel when that happened?" Or, "What was the hardest part of that?" And to my surprise, People opened up in a deeper way than usual. The conversation went from surface-level jokes to real talks about fears, dreams, and challenges. Later, my friend David told me, "Helga, you're such a good listener. I always feel comfortable talking to you." That moment made me realize how listening can actually build trust. People feel safe when they know you'll hear them without judgment or interruption. And trust is the foundation of all great communication. But here's something else I learned. Listening also made me a better speaker. By really paying attention to others, I picked up on how people express themselves, the words they choose, the pauses they take, and the way they emphasize certain points. I noticed when a person leaned forward because they were excited or when their voice softened because they were nervous. It was like I was studying communication in real time without even opening a textbook. And the more I listened, the more I realized how fast I used to speak when I was nervous. I would jump into conversations, rush my words, and sometimes people would ask me to repeat myself. Listening showed me the value of slowing down. If I could give someone else the space to finish their thoughts, why couldn't I give myself that same space when it was my turn? That thought stayed with me. One evening, after a long day of classes, I sat in my dorm room reflecting on all the conversations I had that week. I remembered moments when I had listened well and moments when I had slipped back into old habits. But most of all, I thought about how much calmer and more confident I felt when I didn't rush to talk. Listening had given me a kind of inner patience I didn't have before. And that patience was teaching me something powerful. Good communication isn't about how quickly you speak, it's about how clearly you connect. So, the more I practiced listening, the more I realized I needed to work on my own speech. I didn't want to rush through my words anymore. I wanted to speak in a way that matched the calm, thoughtful energy I was learning through listening. After I had made listening a part of my daily life, I noticed something surprising. The more I listened to people, the more I became aware of my own way of speaking. It was almost like listening opened up a mirror for me. I could suddenly hear myself more clearly in my own head. I realized how often I rushed through my sentences, how my words sometimes tumbled over each other, and how my nervousness showed up in the way I talked. It became obvious one afternoon in my public speaking class. The assignment was simple. We had to give a short, 3-minute talk about any subject we cared about. I chose to talk about my love for writing, thinking it would be easy since it was something close to my heart. But when I got up in front of the class, something happened. My heart raced, my palms got sweaty, and as soon as I started, I felt like I had to get it all out as quickly as possible before my nerves got the best of me. The words flew out of my mouth like bullets. I barely took a breath between sentences. When I finished, there was silence in the room. My professor smiled kindly, but he said, "Helga, I love your enthusiasm, but you need to slow down. We want to enjoy your words, not chase after them." The class laughed a little, not in a mean way, but in a way that told me they agreed. And deep down, I knew he was right. That night, I went back to my dorm feeling a mix of embarrassment and determination. I didn't want people to struggle to understand me. I didn't want my nervous energy to control my speech. I wanted to sound confident, calm, and clear. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and typed into Google, "How to speak clearly and slowly." I spent hours reading articles, watching YouTube videos of great speakers, and even studying clips of TED Talks. One thing that kept coming up again and again was this: clarity is more powerful than speed. The next morning, I decided to start practicing. I stood in front of the mirror in my dorm bathroom, looked at my reflection, and began reading random paragraphs from my textbook, slowly. At first, it felt awkward. I was so used to speaking quickly that slowing down made me feel unnatural, almost like I was dragging my words. But then I noticed something. When I slowed down, I could actually hear the shape of each word. I noticed how some words came out fuzzy if I wasn't careful, while others sounded strong and sharp when I gave them the right attention. That became my new routine. Every morning, I would practice speaking slowly and clearly, even if it was just for a few minutes. I started with reading aloud, but then I challenged myself to slow down in real conversations too. The first time I tried it was at a coffee shop when I ordered a latte. Normally, I would mumble quickly, "Can I get a medium latte, please?" But this time, I looked at the barista, smiled, and said slowly, "Can I get a medium latte, please?" The difference was small, but I noticed she understood me right away and even smiled back. It made me feel oddly powerful, like I had just discovered a secret trick. Of course, it wasn't always easy. There were times I fell back into old habits, especially when I was nervous. One day, in history class, I was asked to share my thoughts on an essay we had read. My heart started pounding again, and before I knew it, I was speeding through my answer like a race car. After class, a friend pulled me aside and said, "Helga, you had some really good points, but you were talking so fast I almost missed them." That stung, but it also pushed me harder. I didn't want my ideas to get lost because of the way I delivered them. So, I came up with little tricks to help myself. One trick was to remind myself to breathe. It sounds simple, but breathing changed everything. Instead of rushing through sentences, I would pause, take a breath, and then continue. Another trick was to imagine I was speaking to a child. Not because people were children, but because when you talk to kids, you naturally slow down, pronounce things more clearly, and make sure they understand you. I also practiced using my phone's voice recorder. I would record myself reading or even just talking about my day, then play it back. At first, it was painful to hear how fast I sounded. But over time, I began to hear the progress. My words were becoming clearer, my pace steadier, and my voice calmer. One of the biggest tests came when I volunteered to help at a local community event. There was a small stage set up in the park, and I was asked to introduce one of the performers. My old self would have panicked, but I took it as a chance to practice. Before walking up to the microphone, I told myself, "Breathe. Slow down. Let them enjoy your words." I started speaking slowly, letting my voice carry, and for the first time, I felt like people were actually hanging on to what I was saying instead of struggling to keep up. Afterward, a woman from the audience came up to me and said, "You have such a clear voice." I could hear every word. That compliment meant more to me than she probably realized. It was proof that my hard work was paying off. As I continued this practice, I also noticed how slowing down changed the way people reacted to me. When I spoke too fast, people sometimes looked confused or even tuned me out. But when I spoke slowly and clearly, people leaned in, nodded, and actually engaged with me. It made conversations feel richer and more meaningful. Another thing I discovered was that speaking slowly gave me time to think. Instead of blurting out the first thing that came to mind, I could choose my words more carefully. This not only made me sound more thoughtful, but also helped me avoid awkward mistakes. It was almost like slowing down gave my brain space to breathe, just as much as it gave my words room to be heard. Of course, practicing this skill wasn't just about sounding better, it was about building confidence. The more I slowed down and spoke clearly, the more in control I felt. I wasn't letting nerves push me around anymore. I was choosing how to communicate, and that choice gave me a new kind of power. But practicing clarity and patience with my words also made me curious about something else. If listening had taught me how important it was to give space to others, and slowing down had taught me how important it was to give space to myself, then what else could I do to make conversations flow better? That's when I began to notice another powerful tool: questions. I realized that no matter how clearly or slowly I spoke, a conversation would die if it was just about me. But when I asked questions, everything opened up. And that discovery led me to the next big step in my journey. After I had learned to listen more carefully and then practice speaking slowly and clearly, I began to notice something else that was missing from my communication. I was getting better at being present, better at expressing myself, but many of my conversations still felt shallow. They went somewhere, but they often ended quickly, and I didn't always feel like I had truly connected with the other person. That's when I realized what I needed next. I had to learn how to ask more questions. For the longest time, I thought being good at communication meant having all the right answers. I thought people respected you when you had something smart to say, or when you could share an opinion that impressed them. But what I discovered was almost the opposite. People feel more connected to you when you care about what they have to say, when you invite them to open up with thoughtful questions. Questions make conversations alive, and I hadn't been asking nearly enough of them. The turning point came during a group project in one of my communication classes. We were assigned to work in teams and come up with a presentation on how media influences young people. Our group met in the library one Saturday afternoon. I remember sitting there, trying to sound impressive by throwing out facts and my own ideas. But I noticed something. The group wasn't really engaged. Some nodded politely, others checked their phones, and the energy was flat. It felt like I was talking at them, not with them. Then I remembered something one of my professors had said: the best communicators aren't the ones with the best answers, they're the ones who ask the best questions. That line suddenly popped into my head. So I decided to try something new. Instead of pushing my own points, I turned to one of my teammates, Sarah, and asked, "What do you think about how social media impacts high school students' confidence?" Her face lit up. She sat up straighter and started sharing her personal experience of mentoring teenagers. Then I turned to Michael and asked, "Do you agree with Sarah, or do you see it differently?" He started sharing his perspective too. Suddenly, the energy in the room shifted. People leaned in. They weren't distracted anymore. We had a real conversation going, and I wasn't carrying it alone. I was just guiding it with questions. That was when it hit me. Questions are powerful. They don't just show interest, they create interest. They make people feel valued, respected, and heard. And they keep the conversation flowing in ways you can't always predict. From that day forward, I decided I was going to practice asking more questions, not just in school projects, but in everyday life. The first place I practiced was with my friends. Normally, when we got together, we talked about classes, stress, or weekend plans. It was fun, but it was routine. One evening, instead of just asking, "How's it going?" and leaving it at that, I asked my friend Emma, "What's been the best part of your week so far?" She paused, smiled, and started telling me about a small victory she'd had at work. The conversation went deeper than usual because the question pulled out something positive and meaningful. Another time, I was sitting in the dining hall with a group of classmates. Instead of talking about myself, I started asking questions like, if you could live anywhere in the US, where would you go, and what's one thing you want to accomplish this year? The answers surprised me. People who were usually quiet started opening up. We learned things about each other we never knew before. By the end of that dinner, I felt like I knew my classmates better than I had in months of casual conversations. What amazed me the most was how much people lit up when I showed interest in them. It wasn't about asking random questions. It was about asking questions that gave people space to share their stories. I realized that questions don't just create better conversations, they create stronger relationships. But I'll be honest, at first, I worried about asking too many questions. I didn't want to sound like I was interrogating people. I wanted it to feel natural, not forced. So I practiced the art of balancing, asking a question, listening carefully, then sharing a little about myself, and then asking another question. It became a rhythm, almost like a dance. One night, I put this into practice in a really meaningful way. I was at a networking event on campus where alumni had come back to talk with students. Normally, I would have been nervous, unsure of what to say to someone successful. But this time, instead of worrying about sounding impressive, I focused on asking questions. I met a woman who worked in marketing, and instead of rambling about my interests, I asked her, "What's the most challenging project you've ever worked on?" Her eyes lit up, and she told me about a national campaign she had helped design. That led me to ask, "What did you learn from that experience?" The conversation flowed so easily that by the end, she handed me her business card and said, "Keep in touch. I'd be happy to mentor you." That never would have happened if I had just talked about myself. Asking more questions didn't just change my conversations, it changed how people saw me. My friends started describing me as someone who was easy to talk to. Professors noticed that my questions in class were more thoughtful, which often led to richer discussions. Even strangers seemed to open up to me more quickly, like the Uber driver who ended up telling me his life story just because I asked, "What do you like most about driving?" And here's the surprising thing. Asking questions also helped me learn more about myself. When you hear other people's perspectives, you start reflecting on your own. When I asked my friends about their dreams, I started thinking more deeply about mine. When I asked professionals about their struggles, I realized everyone faces challenges, even people who seem successful. Questions didn't just build connections, they built wisdom. Of course, like any skill, it took practice. Sometimes I asked questions that fell flat, like when I asked someone at a party, "What motivates you in life?" and they just looked at me like I was being too intense. I learned to match the question to the setting, fun questions in casual situations, deeper questions when the moment was right. It wasn't about asking any question, but about asking the right question at the right time. Over time, I discovered that the most powerful questions weren't complicated. They were simple, open-ended, and genuine. Questions like, "How did that make you feel?" or "What's been on your mind lately?" These questions invited people to share more than yes or no answers. They invited stories, emotions, and real conversations. But asking questions also taught me something else. Communication isn't just about words. As I asked more questions, I began to notice how people answered not just the words they chose, but the way their eyes shifted, the way their hands moved, the tone of their voices. Sometimes their body language told me more than their words ever could. That's when I started realizing that to truly understand people, I needed to go beyond the questions and answers. I needed to pay attention to the unspoken language too. By the time I had learned how powerful questions could be, I thought I had finally figured out the secret to good communication. I was listening more, speaking more clearly, and asking better questions that brought people out of their shells. But something still puzzled me. Sometimes, even when people answered my questions, I felt like their words didn't quite match the way they were acting. For example, a classmate would tell me, "Yeah, I'm fine," but the way she said it, with her arms crossed tightly and her eyes looking down at the floor, told me a different story. Another time, a friend said he was totally excited about a party, but his slouched shoulders and flat tone made me think he didn't really mean it. That's when I realized communication isn't just about words. In fact, a huge part of it happens without words at all. Body language, the way we sit, move, look, and even breathe, speaks louder than sentences. If I wanted to become a truly great communicator, I couldn't ignore what people were saying silently. My first real lesson in body language came in an unexpected place, a job fair on campus. I had signed up to meet recruiters from different companies. I dressed up, printed my resume, and rehearsed what I was going to say. But when I got there, I noticed something. The recruiters weren't just listening to students' words, they were watching them. One recruiter shook hands with a student who barely made eye contact, and I could see his interest drop instantly. Another student walked up with her shoulders hunched, voice barely audible, and the recruiter smiled politely, but moved on quickly. Meanwhile, a student who stood tall, looked the recruiter in the eye, and smiled seemed to capture attention even before he said a word. That hit me like a lightning bolt. The way you carry yourself can determine whether people even want to hear your words in the first place. After that job fair, I started paying closer attention to my own body language. I practiced standing tall, rolling my shoulders back, and keeping my head up when I walked into a room. I realized that confidence doesn't always start in your mind. It can start in your body. When I stood like someone who belonged, I began to feel like I belonged. But body language isn't just about projecting confidence. It's also about showing warmth and openness. I practiced making eye contact, not in a staring contest kind of way, but in a soft, steady way that showed I was engaged. I practiced smiling more often, even in small interactions like saying thank you to the cashier at Target or greeting a neighbor in the elevator. I noticed that people responded differently when I smiled. They smiled back, their voices brightened, and the whole interaction felt more positive. I also became more aware of how I used my hands. I used to fidget a lot, tapping my fingers, playing with my sleeves, or crossing my arms when I was nervous. Once I realized how distracting that was, I started practicing keeping my hands relaxed and using natural gestures to emphasize my words. At first, it felt strange, like I was choreographing my own movements. But the more I paid attention, the more natural it became. Eventually, I didn't have to think about it. It just became part of the way I communicated. One of the most eye-opening experiences came during another group presentation in class. I decided to focus on not just what I said, but how I said it physically. I stood tall, made eye contact with my classmates, and used my hands to highlight important points. For the first time, I felt like my body was working with my words instead of against them. Afterward, my professor complimented me, not only on the clarity of my speech, but also on my presence. That word stuck with me. Presence isn't about being the loudest or smartest person in the room. It's about carrying yourself in a way that makes people want to listen. But the most valuable part of paying attention to body language was what it taught me about other people. By watching their posture, expressions, and movements, I could often sense what they were really feeling. A friend who said she was fine, but kept her arms wrapped around herself clearly wasn't fine. A classmate who kept glancing at the door during a group study session was probably anxious to leave. Once I started noticing these signals, I could respond in more thoughtful ways. Instead of just accepting their words at face value, I could say things like, "Are you sure you're okay? You seem a little down," or, "Hey, do you need to get going? You look like you're in a rush." This didn't just make me a better communicator, it made me a better friend. People started opening up more because they could tell I noticed what they weren't saying. It showed them I cared enough to look deeper, not just listen to surface words. There were also times when reading body language saved me from awkward or uncomfortable situations. For example, once at a social event, I was talking to someone who kept glancing over my shoulder and shifting their weight from foot to foot. Old me might have kept talking, not realizing they were trying to leave. But because I was paying attention, I wrapped up the conversation politely and gave them space. That awareness helped me respect people's unspoken needs and avoid coming across as pushy or self-centered. Paying attention to body language also helped me when I was nervous. There were moments when I felt my heart racing before a presentation or an interview. In the past, I would let those nerves show, crossing my arms, avoiding eye contact, or fidgeting. But now I knew how to manage it. I practiced what's called power posing before big events, standing tall with my hands on my hips, taking deep breaths and holding that posture for a minute or two. It sounds silly, but it worked. It calmed my nerves and made me feel more grounded. When I walked into the room afterward, I looked and felt more confident. One of the most memorable times I used body language was at a Thanksgiving dinner with my roommate's family. I was a little nervous since it was my first time meeting them. But instead of letting that anxiety take over, I focused on my nonverbal cues. I smiled warmly, shook hands firmly, and made steady eye contact as I introduced myself. Throughout dinner, I leaned in when people spoke, nodded to show I was listening, and mirrored their positive gestures. By the end of the night, her mom said, "Helga, you're so easy to talk to. It feels like we've known you forever." That compliment touched me deeply because it showed me that communication isn't just about words, it's about the energy you bring into the room. Over time, paying attention to body language became second nature. Whether I was talking to a professor, catching up with a friend, or meeting someone new, I wasn't just focused on words anymore, I was reading the whole conversation. And because of that, I felt like I could connect with people on a deeper level. But there was still one more step I needed to take. Listening, speaking clearly, asking questions, and paying attention to body language had all given me powerful tools. Yet I realized that tools are only useful if you practice with them in real life. I couldn't just use them in class projects or special events. I had to make them part of my everyday routine. And that's when I decided to challenge myself to practice my communication skills every single day, in every situation, no matter how small. When I think back to the turning point in my journey to improve communication, I realized that the real magic didn't come from reading books or attending workshops. Those things gave me ideas, but they weren't enough. The real change happened when I started practicing every single day in real situations. At first, I thought communication could be learned like any other subject. Sit down, study some techniques, and apply them when needed. But the truth was, just like learning to ride a bike or drive a car, communication was a skill that needed to be lived out in the real world, not only studied in theory. So I challenged myself. Every day, no matter where I was, I would find ways to practice my communication skills, whether it was with family, friends, coworkers, strangers, or even the barista who made my morning coffee. I remember the first time I truly tested myself outside of my comfort zone. It was a Saturday morning, and I went to my favorite local farmer's market. Normally, I would just pick up my vegetables, smile politely at the vendors, and head home. But this time, I told myself I wasn't leaving without having at least one real conversation. My heart was racing, and I felt awkward just thinking about it. Still, I walked up to a stall where a farmer was selling homemade honey. Instead of simply pointing and saying, "1 jar, please," I asked, "How long have you been making honey?" That single question led to a 5-minute conversation where I learned about his beekeeping journey, the challenges of protecting bees in the winter, and even a story about how his family had been in that business for 3 generations. By the end, not only did I buy the honey, but I felt something new. I felt proud of myself. I realized that practicing didn't mean preparing a perfect speech. It simply meant daring to engage in real conversations. After that experience, I made practice my lifestyle. I started small. At the grocery store, instead of staying quiet in line, I might comment on something like, "That looks like a great choice," if someone was buying a popular product. Sometimes people just nodded, but other times they smiled and started talking. At work, I used meetings as a safe training ground. Instead of sitting silently, I asked at least one question or made one clear comment during every meeting. At first, it felt forced, but over time it became natural. What surprised me was how people reacted. They started noticing me more, remembering my name, and even approaching me later to discuss topics we had touched on. It was proof that practicing consistently was helping me grow, not just in skill, but also in visibility and confidence. One of my favorite ways to practice was at coffee shops. There was something so warm and inviting about the atmosphere, and it made practicing easier. At first, I would only chat with the barista, but soon I started conversations with people sitting nearby. One day, while waiting for my order, I saw a woman reading a book that I loved. Instead of keeping quiet, I said, "That's one of my favorite books. What do you think of it so far?" She looked up, smiled, and before I knew it, we had a half-hour conversation about reading, favorite authors, and even our personal lives. That moment taught me that practicing wasn't only about talking, it was about connecting, finding common ground, and building small bridges with people I might never see again, but who still left an impression on me. Practicing every day wasn't always smooth. There were times I stumbled, got nervous, or even regretted what I said. Like the time I mispronounced a word during a work presentation and felt embarrassed. Or when I asked someone a question at the gym, and they gave me a short answer and walked away. In the past, I would have taken those moments as signs to stop trying. But by this point in my journey, I had learned that mistakes weren't failures, they were lessons. Every time I stumbled, I reminded myself that it was better to have tried than to stay silent. And the more I practiced, the less those small stumbles bothered me. What made this daily practice powerful was the way it slowly transformed my confidence. I noticed that when I talked to people more often, I stopped overthinking every word. I didn't script conversations in my head like I used to. Instead, I trusted myself to handle whatever came up. That trust only came because I had so much practice in different situations. Whether I was ordering food at a restaurant, asking for directions in a new city, or chatting with a neighbor while taking out the trash, I treated every moment as practice. And it all added up. One unexpected benefit of practicing daily was the joy it brought me. For so long, I had seen communication as a challenge, something I had to fix about myself. But as I practiced, I started enjoying the process. I began to love meeting new people, hearing their stories, and sharing mine. It was like I had opened the door to a whole new world of connections that had always been there, but had been locked away by my own fear and hesitation. I still remember a conversation I had with an elderly woman at a park bench. I had gone there to clear my head after a stressful week, and she happened to sit next to me. Instead of ignoring her, I said hello. That simple hello led to a heartwarming conversation about her life, her grandchildren, and even her advice on love. Walking away, I felt lighter, happier, and more alive. It was in those moments that I realized communication wasn't just a skill, it was a gift. Of course, practicing daily also meant I had to be intentional. I didn't just wait for opportunities, I created them. If I saw someone struggling with their groceries, I offered help and used it as a way to start a conversation. If a coworker looked stressed, I asked if they wanted to talk. If I was at a networking event, I didn't just stand in the corner, I introduced myself to at least 3 new people. The more I practiced, the more natural it felt. It became part of who I was, not something I had to force. Looking back, I can see how daily practice tied everything together. Listening more, speaking clearly, asking questions, and noticing body language, these were all skills I had learned along the way. But they became truly powerful only when I used them in everyday life. Daily practice was the glue that held all the tips together, the engine that kept my growth moving forward. Without practice, everything else would have remained theory. With practice, it all became reality. Now, when I walk into a room, I don't feel that old nervousness. I feel excited about the chance to connect with people. I know that even if I stumble, I'll recover, because I've done it countless times before. I know that if I ask questions, listen, and use my body language well, I'll create a meaningful conversation. And most importantly, I know that communication is not about being perfect. It's about showing up, trying, and connecting. So yes, the most important tip I can share with anyone is this. Practice every day in real situations. Don't wait for the right moment. Every moment is the right moment. Whether you're at work, school, the grocery store, or just walking your dog in the neighborhood, you can practice. The more you do, the more confident and natural you'll become. And that's how I turned communication from something that once scared me into something that now empowers me. It wasn't a sudden change, but a daily habit, a steady effort that built over time. And little by little, conversation by conversation, I became the communicator I had always wanted to be.